What feeds on you when all you have to offer is your own decay? Can you still call yourself a person when the only witness to your existence is the darkness? What if the last person to remember your name was you, 20 years ago? And what happens when a flicker of light threatens to extinguish the terrible peace you've made with the shadows? Share your thoughts in the comments. The first thing she learned was the taste of the dark. It was not an absence, but a presence, thick and cold on the tongue, flavored with ancient stone, wet rust, and the slow, sweet rot of things forgotten. It was a taste that had weight, pressing down on her chest, filling her lungs with every shuddering breath. When consciousness returned to Mira, it was not with a gentle dawn, but with the brutal finality of iron groaning on iron, a sliver of sickly torchlight from far above, and the nauseating plunge as she fell through the open grate. Her body, all 16 years of it, hit the uneven floor with a crack that echoed not in space around her, but inside her bones. The light vanished, the iron screamed shut, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow descended. For a long time, or perhaps no time at all, for time had died here long before her arrival, she did not move. The pain was a distant, throbbing thing compared to the overwhelming reality of the blackness. She waved a hand in front of her face. Nothing. Not a shape, not a shade. Just a void so complete it felt like her eyes had been scooped out. Panic, a frantic bird, beat its wings against her ribs. She scrambled to her feet, her hands scraping against slime-slick stone as she traced the circumference of her prison. It was small, perhaps 10 paces across. The walls were seamless, curving inward slightly as they rose to a point she could not see. An oubliette, a place to be forgotten. The word, learned from the terrified whispers of other prisoners, now felt like a tombstone etched onto her soul. She was about to scream, to pour all her fear into a sound that would surely shatter in this emptiness, when she heard it. Scritch, scrape, pause, scritch. It was a dry, rhythmic sound, like a bone being dragged across rock. It came from the other side of the wall, or perhaps from within the wall itself. Mira froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then came the whisper. It was not a word, not a language she knew. It was a thread of sound, a frayed exhalation that wove through the scratching. It rose and fell, a tuneless, breathless melody that spoke of broken things and endless nights. The ghost of the deep. The prisoner's legend was true. It was here, with her. Terror pinned her to the spot. She slid down the wall, drawing her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small, invisible. The scratching and the whispering continued, a maddening duet for an audience of one. It was the sound of a mind unraveling, stitch by stitch, over decades. She didn't know how long she sat there, shivering in the pervasive damp cold. Eventually, a different sound echoed from above. The grate being slid open again. A slop bucket was emptied, contents hitting the floor with a wet splatter, and a small water skin followed. Then a narrow beam of torchlight pierced the darkness, not to illuminate, but to taunt. "Hello." Mira's voice was a raw croak, alien in the silence. "Please, is anyone there?" The scratching from the other side of the wall stopped. The whispering ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was even more terrifying. The torchlight shifted, and she could make out the silhouette of a man peering down. A guard. His face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was flat, worn smooth by indifference. "Save your breath, girl," he said. The words fell like stones. "No one hears you down here." "The other one," Mira pleaded, her voice trembling. "There's someone in the next cell." "She's whispering." The guard was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone held a grim finality that chilled her more than the cold stone. "That is not someone," he said, each word measured in cold. "That is an echo, a stain left on this place. Do not listen to it, and if you are wise, it will not learn to listen to you." Before she could form another word, the torchlight vanished, and the iron grate slammed shut, plunging her back into the perfect, whispering dark. Mira hugged her knees tighter, the guard's warning echoing in her mind. But as the scratching and the soft, mad whispering began anew, she knew with a sinking certainty that it was already too late. It had learned she was here, and in the absolute blackness of the oubliette, being heard was far more dangerous than being forgotten. Time became a fluid, meaningless thing in the oubliette. It stretched and contracted not by the sun's passage, but by the rhythms of the body. The gnawing pangs of hunger, the dry ache of thirst, the overwhelming urge to sleep, and the terrifying moments of waking to the same, unyielding blackness. Mira marked its passage by the arrival of the slop bucket and water, a foul, metallic-tasting routine that was her only connection to the world above, a world that was already beginning to feel like a dream. The scratching and whispering from the other side of the wall were the constants, the heartbeat of her new reality. At first, they had been a source of pure terror, a soundtrack to her impending madness. But as the endless dark wore on, her fear began to curdle into a desperate, lonely curiosity. The ghost was her only companion. The echo was the only voice she had. Driven by a need to assert her own existence, to prove she was more than just a body in the dark, she started to speak. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, cracking like old parchment. "My name is Mira," she said to the wall, to the whispering void beyond it. The words sounded small and foolish, swallowed by the silence that followed her statement. "I am 16 years old. I'm from the lower districts. My crime was poetry." She spoke of her mother's face, the memory already blurring at the edges. She described the feeling of sun on her skin, the smell of rain on dusty streets, the taste of fresh bread. She painted pictures with her words, vivid and colorful, a desperate defense against the monochrome of her prison. She received no answer, only the relentless scritch-scrape and the low, murmuring flow of sound. But she persisted. It was a battle against the silence, a battle for her own mind. "They threw me down here for my words," she whispered one day, her cheek pressed against the cold, damp stone of the shared wall. "They were afraid of them. Isn't that strange? To be afraid of words." A long pause, then a shift. The whispering from the other side didn't stop, but it changed. The nonsensical syllables seemed to coalesce, to form around the edges of a word she had just spoken. "Yeffffrid." The voice echoed, a dry rustle of leaves, a breath of tomb air. Myra's heart hammered against her ribs. It was not a conscious reply. She was sure of it. It was a parrot's mimicry, an echo of her own sound. But it was a response. A connection, however fragile, had been made. "Afraid," she repeated, her voice trembling with a wild, desperate hope. Yes, they were afraid. She began to direct her speech, aiming her words like arrows at the source of the whisper. She asked questions, simple ones. "What is your name? How long have you been here? Can you understand me?" For a long time, there was nothing but the maddening scratch of bone on stone. Then, during one of her monologues about the sea, a thing she had only ever read about in books, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence was so jarring Mira stopped speaking mid-sentence. In the void left behind, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural sound, like a stone being dragged over a grave. "Name," the voice rasped, the word fractured and painful. "Name is for the ones above, for the ones who are." A thrill of triumph, so sharp it was almost painful, shot through Mira. It was a coherent thought, a philosophical statement, born from decades of negation. This was not a ghost. This was a person who had been unraveled by the dark, but a person nonetheless. "They called me Elspeth," the voice continued, each word a struggle, as if being pulled from a deep, dry well. "Once, a long forgetting ago, Lady Elspeth." Lady. The title struck Mira with its incongruity. This broken thing in the dark was nobility? What crime could a lady of court have committed to warrant this? "Elspeth," Mira said, testing the name, giving it air, giving it life. It felt like a sacred act. "That's a beautiful name." A harsh, choking sound came from the other side. It took Mira a moment to realize it was laughter. It was the most terrible sound she had ever heard. "Name is a hook," Elspeth whispered, her voice fading back into its previous, less lucid state. "A hook in soft flesh. It holds you, to the pain. Better to be without. The scratching began again, more frantic now, as if to bury the moment of clarity. The whispers returned to their fragmented, nonsensical flow. But Mira sat in the darkness, a slow smile touching her cracked lips. She had done it. She had pulled a name from the void. She had learned that the ghost of the deep was, or had been, Lady Elspeth. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that a name was not a hook to pain, but the first thread she could use to pull her back from the edge, back to being someone, back to being human. The battle was far from over, but the first, crucial skirmish was won. A new rhythm established itself in the abyss, fragile, two-part cadence built on the ruins of silence. Mira spoke, and Elspeth listened. Or at least, Mira hoped she was listening. Her words were no longer just desperate pleas thrown into the void. They were now deliberate offerings, laid at the feet of a broken idol in the hope of a miracle. She became an archaeologist of the senses, digging through her own memories to unearth treasures she could present to the woman in the dark. "Can you remember the smell of rain, Elspeth?" she would ask, her voice low and steady against the ever-present scritch-scrape. Not just the wetness, but the smell. That clean, sharp scent as it hits dry earth. They call it petrichor. It's the smell of the world being made new. She described the crushing weight of the ocean, a force she knew only from sailors' tales. They say it's so heavy it can crush a man's bones in the deep, but on the surface, it can hold up the biggest ships. It's blue and green and gray, all at once, and it tastes of salt and endlessness. She painted pictures of forests, of the dappled sunlight filtering through a canopy of leaves, of the crunch of frost underfoot on a winter morning, of the dizzying sweetness of a ripe summer berry bursting on the tongue. For days, her descriptions were met with only the familiar, maddening whisper, a sound that seemed to actively unravel meaning. But Mira was learning its patterns. She heard when the whisper would hitch, when it would pause for a fraction too long after she mentioned a specific thing, the warmth of a hearth fire, the texture of rough-spun wool. She was building a latticework of sensation in the dark, and somewhere in the tangled ruins of Elspeth's mind, something was beginning to cling to it. The breakthrough came on a day that felt no different from any other. The slop bucket had been lowered and raised. The water skin had been drained. A profound lethargy had settled over Mira, a crushing weight of hopelessness. To combat it, she began to hum. It was a simple, old lullaby, one her mother had sung to her when she was very small. The melody was a frail, trembling thing in the immense dark, a bird with clipped wings trying to remember the sky. She hummed the first few bars, her voice cracking. She started again, stronger this time, letting the familiar tune fill her chest. "Hush now, my darling, the moon's climbed so high, over the mountains, beneath the black sky." She sang the first verse, the childish words feeling both absurd and profoundly sacred in this place of despair. As her voice faded on the last note, the silence that rushed in was different. It was not the passive, empty silence of the oubliette. It was a held breath, a waiting. The scratching had stopped. The whispering had ceased completely. The darkness felt charged, tense. Mira held her own breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then, from the other side of the wall, a sound emerged. It was not a whisper. It was a voice. Faint, cracked with disuse, rusted like an ancient hinge forced to move, but undeniably a voice striving for melody. "The stars are thy sentinels, silent and deep." The line hung in the air, a ghost of a song, a relic from a world long dead. Mira felt tears, hot and sudden, well in her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare breathe. Elspeth's voice, thin and reedy, continued, searching for the next line, as if groping for a lost object in the dark. "To guard thy slumber while the world is asleep." The final word was exhaled more than sung, followed by a sharp, shuddering intake of breath, and then a sob, a raw, guttural, and utterly human sound of agony. It was the sound of a soul being torn in two, of a dam breaking after 20 years. "Gone," Elspeth wailed, the word a shard of glass. "It is all gone. The child, the room, the yellow curtains, the face, my face. The scratching began again, but it was no longer rhythmic. It was frantic, desperate. The sound of claws against stone. A wild animal trying to escape a trap. You remember? Mira whispered, her own voice thick with tears. Elspeth, you remember? The frantic scratching stopped. The voice that came back was not that of a ghost, nor the broken whisper of a nameless thing. It was the voice of a woman, sharp with a pain so fresh it seemed to bleed into the air. Remember? Elspeth hissed, the word venomous. You call this a gift, child? This unveiling? I was at peace in my forgetting. I was nothing, and nothing cannot hurt. Now I am a woman in a hole, and the hole is inside of me. Mira sat stunned, the triumph she had felt moments ago turning to ash in her mouth. She had wanted to bring back a memory, a piece of beauty. She had not realized that with the memory of a lullaby would come the memory of the child it was sung to, the room it was sung in, the life that was lost. She had not just given Elspeth a piece of her humanity back. She had given her the capacity to feel the full, crushing weight of its loss. The darkness was no longer just empty. It was now filled with the sound of a woman mourning her own life, and Mira understood, with a sickening lurch, that some silences were kinder than the truth. She had struck a spark, but the first thing it had illuminated was the sheer, terrifying scale of the ruins. The sobbing did not last. It was a storm that raged itself out, leaving in its wake a silence more profound and more terrible than any that had come before. This was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a wound being cauterized, of a door being slammed shut deep within a soul. Mira waited, her own breath held, straining to hear any sound from the other side of the wall. There was nothing, no scratching, no whisper. It was as if Elspeth had simply vanished, leaving behind only the echo of her anguish. Elspeth, Mira finally ventured, her voice small and timid in the void. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You. The word was a shard of ice, sharp and precise, cutting her off. It held none of the rusted fragility of the voice that had sung the lullaby. This was a new voice, or perhaps a very old one, cold, hard, and resonant with a power that the whispers had never possessed. You brought the poison, the voice continued, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into a black pool. You stirred the sediment. I was settled. I was integrated. The dark and I had reached an understanding. Now you have reminded it that I am a separate thing, and it is not pleased. Reminded what? Mira asked, a fresh chill creeping up her spine. The dark isn't a thing. It's just nothing. A low, humorless chuckle echoed from a wall. It was a dry, rattling sound. You are a child, blinking in a room after the candle has been snuffed. You think the room is empty. I have lived in this room for 20 years. I know its occupants. The cold is a presence. The weight of the stone is a will. The silence is a voice. And I have learned to speak its language. Mira heard a soft, shuffling sound. It was not the frantic scratching from before. It was the sound of movement, deliberate and unsettlingly fluid. It was closer now, right on the other side of the stone, as if Elspeth had pressed herself against it. I do not need light to see you, little poet, Elspeth murmured, her voice now a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to come from just beside Mira's ear. I see you by the sound of your breath. I see the heat of your trembling. I know the pattern of your heartbeat. The dark tells me everything. It is my eyes. It is my skin. A wave of primal revulsion washed over Mira. The guard's words came back to her. She was something far worse and far more tragic. He wasn't just being cruel. He was stating a fact. Elspeth hadn't just survived the darkness. She had adapted to it. She had become a creature of it. This is what you've become. Mira whispered, horror-struck. Become. Elspeth's voice was sharp again, laced with a sudden, venomous anger. This is what was made of me. They did not just throw a woman into a hole. They threw a seed into barren ground and were shocked when something monstrous grew. You asked me if I remember my face. I remember the softness of it, the weakness of it. There was a faint, dry rasp. like a finger tracing a line on stone. This is an improvement. There's no softness left to hurt, no weakness left to betray. But you're not a monster, Mira insisted, the words feeling hollow even as she said them. She was trying to convince herself as much as Elspeth. Am I not? The shuffling sound moved again, circling. What do you call a thing that feeds on forgetfulness? What do you call a thing that has shed its name, its memories, its very face, to better navigate the endless night? You pity the ghost, but you should fear the survivor. The ghost is just a memory. The survivor is what the memory has been sharpened into. The anger in her voice crescendoed, no longer cold, but blazing with a raw, personal fury directed entirely at Mira. You come here with your songs and your smells and your sunlit memories. You try to dress this rotting corpse in the clothes of a lady. You pour your sweet, foolish poison into my ears and make me feel the rot anew. I hate you for it. The last words were a scream that seemed to tear from the very stones, a sound of pure, undiluted agony and rage. It was followed by a violent, scraping impact against the shared wall, as if a body had thrown itself against it. Mira scrambled backward, her heart hammering, until her back hit the opposite curve of her cell. She curled into a ball, shaking. She had wanted to heal, to reconnect. Instead, she had ripped open a festering wound and found not blood, but a creeping, sentient darkness. She had tried to remind a woman of her humanity, and in doing so, had come face to face with the terrifying, elegant thing that humanity had been forced to become in order to endure. Elspeth was right. A ghost was a simple thing, a story to be feared. But this was a tragedy that was still alive, still evolving in the dark, and it had just learned how to hate. The echo of Elspeth's scream faded, leaving a silence that felt bruised and tender. Mira remained pressed against the cold curve of the outer wall, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from a deep, cellular fear. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had screamed back with a human voice. The ghost of the deep was no longer a legend. She was a furious, wounded, and terrifyingly powerful presence, a presence that now despised her. Hours bled into one another. Mira didn't speak. She barely breathed. She simply listened to the frantic, erratic scratching from the other side, a sound that was no longer ritualistic, but frantic, the physical manifestation of a mind in a feedback loop of pain and rage. This was the cost of remembrance. This was the monster her kindness had awakened. When the grate finally screeched open and the slop bucket rained down its foul contents, Mira didn't move. The torchlight beam swept the floor, pausing on her huddled form. Still breathing, girl? Guardian Kale's voice was flat, but there was a hint of something else, a grim satisfaction. The silence is easier, isn't it? I told you not to listen. His words were a spark that lit the tinder of her defiance. He was wrong. The silence wasn't easier. It was a surrender. It was what the oubliette, what Kale, what this entire system wanted. For them to be isolated, broken, and silent. Elspeth's rage, however terrifying, was a form of resistance. It was life, however twisted. As the grate slammed shut, plunging her back into blackness, Mira made a decision. She could not fight the darkness for Elspeth, but she could stop fighting Elspeth herself. She waited until the scratching subsided into exhausted, hiccuping pauses. You're right, Mira said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. The scratching stopped. I was trying to bring back the world out there, she continued, gesturing vaguely upward though no one could see. I was a fool. That world is the one that put us here. Why would you want to remember it? She shifted, turning to face the wall again, not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. Your world is here. This stone, this dark, the sounds, the guards. That is your reality. It is mine now, too. Tell me about this world, Elspeth. Teach me its rules. There was a long, considering silence. The air itself seemed to thicken, waiting. The rules. Elspeth's voice came, not as a scream or whisper, but as a low, measured tone. The fury was gone, banked for now, replaced by a wary curiosity. The first rule is, the The stone hears everything, and tells me. Tell me what it says. Mira pressed. The man Kale. He has a limp in his left leg. The weight is uneven. He comes 3 times after the long silence, the one you call night. He breathes through his mouth. He is afraid of the dark in this corridor. His heartbeat is faster here than anywhere else. Mira's mind raced. This wasn't madness. This was intelligence. Hyperacute, survival-based intelligence, gathered over 20 years. What else? The water, Elspeth said, her voice dropping. It is not just water. Sometimes bitter. A lethargy follows. They put something in it when they are concerned, when the sounds from the cells are too loud. A cold understanding dawned on Mira. The sporadic days of overwhelming weakness, the feeling of her thoughts being smothered in wool. We need to know when, Mira said, the we hanging in the air, a deliberate and fragile alliance. We need a signal, a way to know what the stone is saying to you. A new sound came from the other side. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. 2 taps. For the bitter water. 3 for danger. For food. When the slop has more than just rot. It was a code. A language born of the oubliette itself. Show me again, Mira said, and she began to tap back against the stone with her knuckle. The sound a tiny, defiant drumbeat in the immense dark. Tap. Tap, tap, tap. A strange, guttural sound came from Elspeth's side. It took Mira a moment to realize it was not a sound of distress. It was a sound of satisfaction. In the days that followed, the dynamic transformed. They were no longer the healer and the patient, the girl and the ghost. They were co-conspirators in a lightless kingdom. Mira's youth and resilience, paired with Elspeth's preternatural senses and ancient grudges. They developed their own economy. Mira would describe the consistency of the slop, and Elspeth would use her knowledge of the guards' routines to advise when it was safest to eat. They shared warnings. They shared frustrations. They shared the crushing weight of the silence, now made bearable because it was a silence they were breaking together. Mira stopped trying to remind Elspeth of the woman she was. She started learning from the creature she had become, and in doing so, she gave Elspeth a new purpose, one that did not require the painful resurrection of a dead past, but the shrewd navigation of a shared, monstrous present. They were not lady and poet. They were not human and ghost. They were 2 survivors, and in the economy of the oubliette, that was a bond stronger than memory. The pact changed everything. The oubliette was no longer a solitary confinement of the soul. It had become a shared kingdom, its borders defined by the reach of their coded taps and low, murmured stratagems. Mira learned to listen to the darkness as Elspeth did, not with her eyes, but with her skin, her ears, the very roots of her hair. She learned that the quality of the silence changed minutes before the grate opened. A slight shift in the air pressure, a distant, almost imperceptible vibration in the stone. Elspeth had been feeling these things for decades. She was now teaching Mira the grammar of their prison, but their newfound alliance did not go unnoticed. Guardian Kale was a man whose soul had been worn smooth by the relentless drip of misery in those underground passages. He preferred his charges broken, silent, or mad. It was easier. The frantic scratching of the old one and the terrified whimpers of the new one had been the established, predictable order. What he heard now unsettled him. The whimpering had stopped. The scratching was no longer random, but had been replaced by an occasional, deliberate tap-tap-tap that echoed with a purpose that felt like a challenge. Worse were the silences. They were no longer empty. They were full. They were the silences of people listening, not the silences of people who had given up. During one of his deliveries, he lingered by the grate a moment longer than usual, his torchlight piercing the gloom below. He saw Mira. She wasn't huddled in a ball anymore. She was sitting upright, her back straight against the wall she shared with the old woman. Her face, grimy and hollowed, was turned upwards, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been wide with terror, now reflected his torchlight with a flat, unnerving calm. They held no plea, no fear, only a watchful, calculating stillness. It was the look of a prisoner who was no longer merely a prisoner. He slid the grate shut with more force than necessary, the iron clang of futile assertion of his power. As he turned to leave, he heard it. Not a whisper, not a tap. It was a low, soft hum, the same few notes of a lullaby, repeated. It wasn't coming from the girl's cell. It was emanating from the old one's, and it was answered, a moment later, by a soft, almost inaudible sigh from the girl, a sound of acknowledgement, of solidarity, a cold knot tightened in Cale's stomach. They were communicating. They were organizing. He found his pretext a few days later. He had doped the water, as was his custom when he felt the need to reassert control. When he opened the grate, instead of the usual slow, lethargic movement from Mira's cell, she was already looking up, her gaze sharp. "The water tastes of metal today," she said, her voice clear. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement, an accusation. Cale froze. They weren't supposed to notice. They were supposed to drink and slip into a grateful stupor. How did she know? His eyes darted to the wall separating the two cells. He imagined the old woman on the other side, her ear pressed to the stone, her ruined voice hissing a warning. She had known. She had told the girl. Rage, hot and sudden, flushed through him. This was her doing. The old which was corrupting the new one, turning her from a broken thing into a problem. He needed to sever this connection. He leaned over the grate, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think you found a friend in the dark, girl?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think that thing is your ally. It is a cancer. It has festered here for so long it has become part of the rot. It will not save you. It will only teach you how to be a different kind of corpse." Mira did not flinch. She simply looked back at him, and in that look, he saw the reflection of his own fear. He was not the master of this domain, not truly. There was a power here older than his, a knowledge of the dark that he could never possess. "The water, Cale," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "It tastes of metal." He snarled and slammed the grate shut, plunging her into darkness. But as he stormed away, the echo of his own footsteps taunting him, he knew he had lost this round. His threats were empty, and they both knew it. He could not reach the old woman, and the girl was now under her protection. He was the keeper of the oubliette, but in the deep, silent dark below, a new power was rising, and for the first time in 20 years, the ghost of the deep was not whispering alone. She was conspiring, and Cale, the man with the keys, was suddenly, terribly, on the outside. The confrontation with Cale had left a new kind of tension humming in the air, a taut wire of shared defiance. They had faced down their keeper, and he had retreated. It was a small, potent victory that tasted sweeter than any clean water. In the wake of it, their pact solidified. They were no longer just allies. They were a cabal of two, a secret society with a membership of the damned. It was during this fragile zenith of their solidarity that fortune, for the first time, offered a token. The grate screeched open. Cale's routine was hurried, his movements brusque with barely contained anger. The slop splattered down, the waterskin followed, and then a mistake. A small, clattering sound, distinct from the wet thuds. Something hard and light bounced off the stone floor and skittered into a corner. Mira's breath hitched. She remained perfectly still until the grate slammed shut and Cale's footsteps faded. Then, she scrambled on her hands and knees, her fingers frantically patting the slime-slick stone. Her heart leaped into her throat when they closed around a small, cool, cylindrical object. A tinderbox. The flint and steel were missing, lost in the drop, or perhaps never there. But nestled within the small, dry cavity was a single, precious cake of calf. It was no bigger than her thumbnail. A spark. A tiny, dormant sun. She clutched it in her fist, as if it were a beating heart. "Elspeth," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. He dropped something. "A fire starter. There's Cav." The silence from the other side was absolute. It was the silence of a breath held for 20 years. No, the word was a whip-crack in the dark. "Throw it into the slop. Now." "What? Why?" Mira's fist tightened around the precious object. "It's light, Elspeth. Real light." "It is a lie." Elspeth's voice was sharp, frayed with a panic Mira had never heard before. "It is a pain you cannot conceive. It will show you things you can never unsee. It is a weapon, not a tool. Destroy it." But Mira was already moving, driven by an instinct older than fear, older than reason. The primal human need to banish the dark. She scrabbled for a piece of loose stone, positioning the calf cake on a dry patch of her tunic. Her hands shook as she struck the stone against the metal striker. Click, click, nothing. Click, click. A spark, tiny and furious, leapt from the metal and died on the stone floor. "Stop," Elspeth pleaded, her voice now a raw, desperate whisper. "Mira, I am begging you. Do not do this." Click. A larger spark, a brilliant orange-white ember, landed squarely on the calf. For a moment, nothing. Then a tiny, hesitant flame sputtered to life. It was no bigger than a pearl, weak and trembling, its light barely pushing back the shadows a hand's breadth from its source. To Mira, it was a supernova. She gasped, tears of wonder filling her eyes. She could see her own grimy hands, the texture of the stone beneath her, the faint outline of the walls. It was a miracle. She cupped her hands around the tiny, living thing, this piece of the outside world, this defiance of every law of the oubliette. "Elspeth," she breathed, her voice full of reverent joy. "I can see. It's so small, but it's real." She turned, her body shielding the precious flame, and shuffled towards the shared wall. "Look, just for a second. See it with me." She moved her hands, allowing the flickering light to spill through the gaps in the ancient, ill-fitted stones. What happened next would be seared into her memory forever. The light fell upon Elspeth. It was not a woman the flame illuminated. It was an anatomy lesson of suffering. A skeletal face, skin stretched like parchment over a sharp skull, clung with a few remaining wisps of white hair. The eyes were not eyes as Mira knew them, but wide, milky orbs, impossibly large in the shrunken face, their pupils permanently dilated to drink in a light that never came. They did not blink. They stared, unseeing and yet seeing everything, reflecting the tiny flame with a hellish gleam. And the skin, it was not just pale. It was the color of something that had never known the sun, a translucent, mushroom white, mapped with a web of blue veins and old scars. One long, claw-like hand was raised, not in a gesture of greeting, but as a shield against the unbearable assault of illumination. A sound ripped from Elspeth's throat, not a scream, but a strangled, guttural shriek of pure animal agony. It was the sound of a creature being flayed alive. She scrambled backward, a frantic, crab-like motion, her limbs moving in a jerky, unnatural way, until she was pressed into the farthest, darkest corner of her cell, her body contorted into a tight ball. Her hands clawed at her own face, as if trying to tear the image of the light from her ruined eyes. "Put it out," she screamed, her voice cracking with a pain that was more than physical. "Put it out. It burns. It burns." The tiny flame in Mira's hand was no longer a miracle. It was a brand of iron, a searing torch of truth. She had not brought light to her friend. She had subjected her to a torture more exquisite than any darkness. With a cry of horror and guilt, Mira dashed the calf cake to the stone and ground it under her heel until the last ember was extinguished. The absolute blackness rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. It was now filled with the sound of Elspeth's ragged, hysterical sobs and the frantic, skittering sounds of her trying to burrow into the stone itself. Mira sat in the sudden, terrible dark, the afterimage of the monstrous, beautiful face burned onto the back of her eyelids. She had wanted to share a spark. Instead, she had learned a terrible, final lesson. Some things, once surrendered to the dark, can never truly be brought back into the light. The aftermath of the light was a new kind of hell, one of Mira's own making. The frantic sounds from Elspeth's cell eventually subsided, not into peace, but into a silence so deep and wounded it felt like a physical void between them. The coded taps ceased. The murmured stratagems ended. When Mira whispered her name into the darkness, it was met with a stillness that was more absolute than any she had known since her first day. She had not merely hurt Elspeth. She had shattered the fragile trust they had built, proving that her world of light and memory was, as Elspeth had always claimed, a poison. Guilt was a rat gnawing at her insides. She had been so arrogant, so sure that her gift was a blessing. She had forced a queen of shadows to look upon her own ruin, and the queen had retreated, broken, into her kingdom. Days bled together in a monotony of despair. Cale, sensing the shift, resumed his deliveries with a grim smirk. The balance of power had been restored. The cabal was broken. It was during one of these deliveries, as the slop hit the floor, that a sound broke the long silence. It was not a whisper nor a sob. It was a single, clear, coded tap against the stone. Tap. Mira froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A pause, then another. Tap. Tap. It was their signal. Not for bitter water, not for danger. It was the one they had never formally assigned, but had understood nonetheless. The signal for attention, for connection. Trembling, Mira shuffled to the wall and tapped back. Tap, tap. I hear you. The voice that came through the stone was different. It was not the hiss of the creature, nor the broken rasp of the forgotten lady. It was weathered, like stone smoothed by a relentless sea, and held a terrifying, profound calm. The light, Elspeth began, and Mira braced for the accusation. But it did not come. The light showed me many things. It showed my face, and it showed me your eyes. Mira closed her eyes, the memory of that horrific, beautiful visage flashing before her. You did not look away in disgust, Elspeth continued, her voice a low, steady stream. You looked with grief. You saw what was taken from me. Not my title, not my youth, my form, my place in the world of things that are seen. She paused, and Mira could almost feel her gathering the scattered pieces of a thought that had been 20 years in the making. You forced me to remember what I was. But in your eyes, I also saw what I am. I am not Lady Elspeth. I am not the ghost. I am the one who remembers both, and I am the one who survived. A profound shift occurred in the darkness. It was not Mira pulling Elspeth back. It was Elspeth, having finally integrated the searing pain of the present with the ghost of her past, stepping fully into her own power. Cale believes the light broke us, Elspeth whispered, and now her voice held a new, dangerous edge. He is a fool. It forged us. He thinks he holds the only keys. He is wrong. What do you mean? Mira breathed. The day they threw me down here, Elspeth said, her voice dropping to a thread of sound. I did not go quietly. I fought. I scratched. I bit. And I tore a piece of cloth from the coat of the man who condemned me. I have kept it all these years. Woven into its threads is the crest of a serpent coiled around a key. The crest of Lord Valerius, the king's spymaster. The air left Mira's lungs. Valerius, the most feared and powerful man in the kingdom, a shadow who moved behind the throne. My crime was not treason, Elspeth said, the truth finally emerging from the depths of her memory, polished sharp by the recent trauma. It was knowledge. I knew he was not the king's loyal servant. I knew he was the puppet master, and the king his puppet. He could not have me speak of it, so he placed me here, where all words are consumed by stone. She fell silent, letting the weight of the revelation settle in the dark. The oubliette was not just a prison for criminals. It was a hiding place for the regime's most dangerous secrets. This is the truth you will carry out of here, Mira, Elspeth said, her voice now filled with a fierce, undeniable purpose. You will not just carry my name. You will carry his. You will be the light that exposes his rot. But how? Mira asked, her mind reeling. We are still in here. Not for long, Elspeth whispered. Cale is afraid. The system is brittle. You are young, and you have a fire in you that even this darkness cannot extinguish. You will find a way, and when you do, you will tell them. You will tell them that Lady Elspeth did not break. You will tell them that the ghost of the deep remembers everything. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet preparation. Elspeth, drawing on a lifetime of courtly cunning buried under decades of madness, began to drill Mira. Names, dates, the layout of the old palace, the secret passages, the location of Valerius's private study. It was a crash course in a dead woman's vengeance, passed through a stone wall in the dark. The end came abruptly. Kale, his paranoia grown, decided to move Mira, to separate them for good. When the grate opened and his scowling face appeared, Mira knew it was time. As Kale lowered the rope to bind her, Mira looked up, her face a mask of calm defiance. "She says to tell you," Mira said, her voice clear and carrying, "that the serpent's key is rusted." Kale froze, his face draining of color. He knew the phrase. He knew the crest. He understood, in that single, cryptic sentence, that the secret he had been guarding was no longer safe. From the other side of the wall, a sound began. It was not a whisper. It was a song. Elspeth's voice, stronger than it had been in 20 years, rose in that ancient lullaby, the one that had first bridged their worlds. It was no longer a sound of sorrow. It was a battle hymn, a victory chant, a promise. "Hush now, my darling. The moon's climbed so high, over the mountains, beneath the black sky." Kale, shaken, hauled Mira up roughly. As she was pulled from the oubliette, the last thing she heard was not a scream, not a whisper, but a song, a beautiful, terrible, and unbreakable song echoing from the depths, a testament to a humanity that had not been reclaimed, but transcended. Mira blinked in the torchlight of the corridor, her mind already weaving the story she would tell. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a messenger, and she carried with her the most powerful weapon of all, a story from the dark. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comments section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you gave our video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the cards section at the top right. See you in the next video.
Marble skies where the eagles soar, dust of centuries, an open door, chariots whisper on forgotten stone.